Continuing from our discussion on Hölderlin and Novalis, we now turn to Hegel, whose work represents a significant evolution in German idealism. He himself described his Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807, as a voyage of discovery. This wasn't just any book, it was his first major published work, a culmination of youthful thoughts tackling problems that had long been bothering him. Interestingly, Hegel seemed quite conflicted about it later in his career. He wouldn't lecture on it in Berlin, even disavowed it as the proper introduction to his system in 1825. Yet paradoxically, he signed a contract right before his death in 1831 to publish a revised edition. Contrast this with his Logic, published earlier between 1812 and 1816, which he consistently viewed as the fundamental cornerstone of his entire philosophical edifice. Despite later revisions, he never wavered on its central importance. What's fascinating is that while the Logic remained his intellectual bedrock, it gradually lost favor with students over time, overshadowed by the growing popularity of the Phenomenology. After Hegel's passing, the Phenomenology really took off, becoming the dominant text for understanding Hegel. So, how did this voyage of discovery begin? Let's rewind to 1801 when Hegel arrives in Jena. He's essentially an unknown quantity, scraping by on a tiny stipend as a home tutor, a Hofmeister. His only previous publication was an anonymous translation and commentary on a French political pamphlet about tensions in Bern between German-speaking oligarchs and French speakers. He'd tried, without much luck, to make it as an independent writer, grappling with big questions about modern society, religion, and freedom in the wake of the French Revolution. Was Christianity even adequate for modern demands of freedom? These were the kinds of things he was wrestling with. Then came the pivotal moment, reuniting with Friedrich Hölderlin, his closest friend from their Tübingen seminary days. Hölderlin wasn't just a poet, he was deeply philosophical, and their intense, animated discussions in Frankfurt profoundly shifted Hegel's entire trajectory, both intellectually and personally. It wasn't just a minor adjustment, it was a complete overhaul of his life plan. Now, who was this influential figure, Hölderlin? He'd studied with Fichte during those intellectually explosive years in Jena in the late 1790s. He was part of a group including figures like Niethammer, quietly critiquing Fichte's system. They weren't necessarily trying to revive Kant in a literal sense, but rather use Kant's framework to push beyond the perceived limitations of Fichte's own interpretation. By around 1795, Hölderlin himself had broken away from Fichte's path. He identified a core issue with Fichte's approach, which he likely discussed extensively with Hegel. Fichte, you'll recall, concluded that all our knowledge claims, moral claims, could be revised except for the claim that I exist. This pure I had to posit what was normative for itself and also posit a not I, the necessary external constraints or norms that the I didn't create. Hölderlin's counter-argument was sharp. Fichte's problem stemmed from starting too subjectively. You begin with this picture of a subject evaluating experiences, choosing norms. But how do you justify those chosen norms? Fichte's answer, rooted in self-consciousness, felt insufficient. Hölderlin argued that Fichte missed something crucial. Before we even get to the act of consciously positing norms, there has to be a deeper, more fundamental unity. Think of it as a kind of primordial orientation, something that predates all our specific orientations. This underlying unity, Hölderlin called it being sane. And because it's the foundation, it must come before any judgment we make about it. He cleverly played on the German word for judgment, Urteil, suggesting that all judgments are actually primordial divisions, Urteilung, of this deeper unity. To grasp this, remember the post-Kantian context. Both Kant and Fichte showed that knowledge isn't direct perception, it's mediated. Making a judgment, as Kant put it, means following a rule. Those rules are needed for a unified self-consciousness, for the I to recognize itself across different experiences. To get it right, we need rules valid for a universal self-consciousness. Hölderlin's point cuts deeper. All this mediated knowledge, all these judgments, presuppose something that can't itself be judged or articulated judgmentally, namely, this original unity of thought and being. This wasn't just an academic debate for Hegel. Initially, he was focused on applying Kantian ideas to the messy reality of revolutionary Europe, positioning himself as a popular philosopher. But Hölderlin's insights forced him to confront the deeper, more fundamental questions he'd been sidestepping. The turning point came in 1799 with his father's death. Reality hit hard, and Hegel had to decide on a career. Shaken by these new philosophical ideas, especially after seeing Hölderlin's own disillusionment with his situation in Frankfurt, Hegel decided to use his small inheritance to move to Jena. Why Jena? Because his other close friend from Tübingen, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, had become a major rising star there, championing a philosophy seen as moving beyond Fichte. His time in Jena from 1801 to 1807 was transformative. It was a period of almost unparalleled intellectual growth, where he truly became the philosopher he would become. Life in Jena wasn't easy initially. Hegel managed to join the faculty but unpaid. He worked closely with Schelling on a journal promoting Schelling's philosophy, framing it as a development beyond Fichte. However, when Schelling left Jena in 1803 due to a scandal, Hegel was left on his own. He faced severe financial pressure and bouts of deep depression. Yet, amidst these struggles, he embarked on a heroic intellectual effort. He was trying to weave together his earlier interests in the possibilities of modern life, his broadening historical and intellectual horizons, and the profound influences of both Hölderlin and Schelling. It was a difficult synthesis under duress. Through this period, marked by published articles and numerous unpublished works, he finally brought his efforts to fruition with the epochal publication of the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. In the Phenomenology, Hegel didn't just borrow Hölderlin's insight, he significantly transformed it. Remember Hölderlin's primordial unity of thought and being? Hegel reconceptualized this not as some abstract metaphysical entity, but as an intersubjective unity. This means it's a shared reality constructed through patterns of mutual recognition among agents. Crucially, Hegel believed he had to demonstrate why this shift was historically necessary. It wasn't just another philosophical possibility. He argued that this conception of mind emerging through recognition had become required of us by history itself. He needed to show the historical path that led to this understanding. This drive for a new conception wasn't happening in a vacuum. Back in Frankfurt, Hegel and Hölderlin shared a conviction that their revolutionary era demanded a new sensibility. They termed this a new mythology of reason. This wasn't about abandoning rigor. It was about forging a language that was both rigorous and novel. A language that wouldn't let readers passively absorb ideas, but would force them to actively engage, to participate in thinking through the issues, preventing them from slipping back into comfortable, unexamined assumptions. This project was also explicitly aimed at confronting critics like Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who argued that the Enlightenment's reliance on reason was ultimately self-defeating, leading inevitably to skepticism or nihilism. Hegel intended to show that reason, properly understood, could avoid this trap. Jacobi's argument was potent. He claimed the only alternative to the Enlightenment's rationalism was immediate, non-inferential knowledge, things existing independently of our awareness. If we accept faith for physical objects, why not for God too? Hegel tackled this head-on, right at the beginning of the Phenomenology. His core point was that there's no possible direct awareness of any object that could by itself fix the normative commitments of our judgments. Think about it. Even if you try to articulate sense certainty, you immediately start characterizing things as complex unities, individual things possessing general properties. And perceiving those properties already requires a background understanding of laws and forces, things not directly perceived but posited by the understanding faculty. But when you try to judge the structure of these laws, the understanding itself generates contradictions, antinomies, that it can't resolve on its own. So, Hegel argued, there's no intelligible form of direct awareness, neither sensory nor intellectual, that can serve as the ultimate foundation for our norms. So, if direct awareness fails as a foundation, what does Hegel propose? We are never simply aware of things as they are. Instead, we are always aware of things as such and such. When we make a judgment, we are actively taking things to be this way or that. It's not a passive reporting of a directly confronting world. As Hegel puts it, our consciousness of objects inherently involves our self-consciousness of taking them to be in a certain way. We are always already interpreting, always already making a claim about how things are. This reframes the entire problem. If our judgments involve taking things to be a certain way, then the real question becomes how we handle the seemingly contradictory views that arise within our own consciousness of the world. If our judgments are essentially acts of taking things to be a certain way, and these acts inevitably involve us, then the contradictions we find within our own consciousness of the world cannot be resolved just by looking at the objects themselves. Whether we look at sensory perceptions or intellectual intuitions, the contradictions persist. Therefore, Hegel argues, these conflicts must be resolved in terms of the purposes we assume ourselves to be accomplishing in making those judgments. The focus shifts from the object being judged to the agent doing the judging, and the agent's self-understanding regarding their aims and projects. This leads Hegel to a radical reformulation of Kant. Kant said, we follow rules generated by the understanding, and these rules are needed for ascribing experiences to a universal self-consciousness. But Hegel asks, who or what determines the rules for this universal self-consciousness? At first glance, maybe life itself, the biological imperatives of survival and reproduction? But Hegel refutes this. As a self-conscious agent, aware of taking things to be a certain way, we can never simply be natural beings. We are pursuing the fulfillment of desires, but we rank those desires ourselves. We have a negative relation to our desires. We don't just passively follow them. We are not just what we naturally are, but we are what we are in terms of this potential self-relation, our implicit project for life. It's this project, not raw life, that determines the norms by which we rank our desires. This immediately raises a problem. How can an agent legitimize the norms derived from their own project? Appealing to what's necessary for achieving their aims seems circular. Legitimacy requires showing that these norms align with what other agents would do if they were getting it right, embodying universal self-consciousness. But here's the rub. Without some external mediator, each agent inevitably claims that their own way of following their project is the right way, identical to what all agents should grasp. This leads to a fundamental conflict. When individual agents confront each other, demanding recognition of their particular norms as universal, a life and death struggle for recognition erupts. Each wants the other to recognize their perspective as the legitimate one. What happens in this struggle? Typically, one agent dominates the other. The victor becomes the master Herr, imposing his norms. The defeated agent becomes the vassal, Knecht, acquiescing out of fear, accepting the master's viewpoint as authoritative for him. The vassal's work, whether practical or theoretical, is done only in terms of the master's projects, not his own. However, in this subservience, the vassal paradoxically gains a degree of independence. He's less dependent on nature, and, crucially, less dependent on the master's arbitrary whims. This emerging independence sets the stage for reflection. The vassal starts reflecting on his status. What once seemed like the objective, universal norms now appear contingent, the result of mere passions, luck, and the exercise of power. His normative allegiance to those principles weakens. Simultaneously, the master realizes the vassal's recognition is merely compelled, not genuine. This undermines the master's own normative commitment too. Both sides see their foundation shaken. This master-slave dialectic is paradigmatic for Hegel's entire method in the Phenomenology. It shows how a situation generates its own critique and points towards its potential resolution. How is this dialectic resolved? Through mutual recognition. Instead of one imposing norms on another, each agent reciprocally imposes norms on the other in a spontaneous, self-bootstrapping way. This sense of mutual recognition, however, isn't something we fall into naturally. It must be historically constructed because, as we've seen, there's no direct object that fixes our norms. The very gap between our norms and our natural status as sensing, desiring beings creates a potential for alienation. As our self-reflections undermine our self-relation, we create a history for ourselves. Our possibilities and requirements are never just abstract reflections, but are always shaped by our past. The rest of the Phenomenology is Hegel's unprecedented argument about what European history made possible and necessary, culminating in this achievement of a form of mutual recognition required for moderns. Hegel traces this historical path. With the collapse of ancient slave-owning societies, stoical or skeptical stances towards norms seemed necessary. Only by affirming our own freedom, adopting a negative stance towards all norms, could agents feel at home. However, this kind of skepticism proved self-defeating. It couldn't sustain an affirmation of unconditioned human freedom, leading to despair as old ways crumbled. Despairing of finding norms internally, humanity became ready for norms coming from outside, via revelation from an unchangeable source. This manifested as a mutual subjection to a metaphysical master mediated by priests, the medieval church. This reign of universal servitude, expressed as devotion to a higher truth, paradoxically put humanity in a position to formulate true norms, as those of a completely objective point of view, gradually identified with reason itself. Then came the early moderns. Galileo and Bacon's science reassured them of reason's power. The norms of universal self-consciousness seemed aligned with the requirements of pure reason. Applying reason to human affairs, however, proved trickier. Rational criticism dissolved not just old norms but also their modern successors. Attempts like the Faustian pursuit of knowledge for desire's sake, appeals to the heart's laws, or a neo-Stoic virtue identifying true self-interest with altruism all failed under scrutiny, generating contradictions. This led to the Rousseauian and Herderian idea of a fixed authentic self behind our plans and desires, setting the norms. But this authentic self, upon closer reflection, unraveled. It turned out to be just as open to interpretation as our actions. What was needed, then, was a conception of reason constituted through social practice, mutual recognition, conferral of entitlements, and undertaking commitments. Kant's kingdom of ends captured this, persons mutually legislating for each other. What's rational is what fits principles of such a community. But this had explosive consequences. First, unconditional reason seemed relative to what counts as a worthy way of life. Second, Kant didn't provide clear guidance on how to derive specific principles. This precipitated the modern crisis of reason and fueled Jacobi's charges of impending nihilism. For reason's claims to be vindicated, Hegel argued, it had to be shown that the modern appeal to reason could generate a determinate orientation, and was itself required by the failures of past ways of life. This need led Hegel to supplement his chapter on reason with an even longer chapter on the history of spirit Geist. He started with ancient Greece, the paradigm of spontaneous ethical harmony. Greeks acting according to their social roles believed their actions would be harmonious, creating a beautiful social whole. But Sophocles' Antigone exposed the deep contradictions. Antigone acting rightly according to divine law destroys Creon acting rightly according to civic law. This clash of right with right provoked reflection, undermining the immediate faith needed for that harmony. Subsequent attempts to recreate a worthy way of life lacking this harmony resulted in extended European self-alienation. Hegel traces this alienation from the formal unity of the Roman Empire, held together by force, not common ends, to the failures of early modern aristocratic ideals merging with bourgeois ones. The Enlightenment and emotionalist religions led to inconclusive skirmishes. This produced the fragmented social whole of modernity, embodying contradictory ideals and seemingly unable to guide. Out of this despair, the French Revolution emerged, aiming for self-grounding through free, self-determining subjectivity. But lacking institutional support for absolute freedom, it descended into terror, sacrificing individuals on the altar of the abstract nation and revolution. The revolution's destruction allowed Kant's reconception of self-consciousness, spontaneity, autonomy, the moral worldview, to be seen as the penultimate expression of modern rupture. This ideal involved recognizing the dignity of all, willing as a member of the kingdom of ends. Kant and Fichte acknowledged the difficulty. Acting purely for duty's sake, without personal aims, isn't agency. So they've resorted to postulates of reward. The Romantics seized on this rigorism, arguing it ignored individual uniqueness and emotional connection. They rejected obedience to the moral law, substituting being true to oneself. The authentic Romantic became the beautiful soul, inwardly pure but fearing action's fragmentation. This split into moralists clinging to purity and ironists acting detachedly. This emphasis on authenticity led to endless accusations of hypocrisy. Each side accused the other of pretending morality while pursuing self-interest. This frenzy revealed a deeper truth. Each agent is just a particular viewpoint. Separating personal interest from morality is impossible. There's no fixed anchor, neither external moral law nor internal authentic self, to definitively ground norms. Only the modern acknowledgement of our mutual dependencies for mindedness puts us in a position to rationally evaluate rightness in this fragmented world. Consequently, the only way to reconcile with this fragmented modern world, to see it as necessary and right, is through a form of Christian reconciliation. Acknowledging we're all sinners, needing mutual forgiveness for substituting our personal interests for universal requirements. Just as the Reason chapter needed a history of spirit, the discussion of Christian reconciliation required an account of why Christianity became the fully modern religion of both humanity and freedom. For Hegel, religious practice is inherently collective reflection on what ultimately matters, sharing characteristics with art and philosophy. It progresses historically. Early forms were nature religions, divine as an abstract natural whole. These culminated in Egypt, paving the way for Greek religion, where gods took human beauty. After the alienation of Rome, Christianity appeared as revelation, God is Geist, mind, divine, and human concerns are harmonized, the divine became human in Jesus. Christianity, as a religion of general humanity, interiority, and freedom, not authoritarian obedience, was the ground where modern life took root and could reconcile itself. Even modern Protestantism, however, couldn't fully articulate this truth about itself. It relied on devotion, rites, symbols. For conceptual articulation, we need philosophy, absolute knowing. Modern life, Hegel argues, is the culmination of the master-slave dialectic, overcoming one-sided norm imposition through mutual binding. The modern faith in reason redeems itself only by understanding that rationality emerges within our own practices, within a determinate type of mutual dependency, acknowledging the contingency and fallibility of all human projects. This understanding provides a basis for perpetual forgiveness when we inevitably fail. The historical project, comprehending how the past determined the present, completes itself in philosophical self-knowing, the final chapter of the Phenomenology, Hegel's Voyage of Discovery. Interestingly, Hegel himself noted in 1831 that the Phenomenology was written when the abstract absolute dominated. His science of logic, developed later, took that central insight from Hölderlin but pursued it in a different format and direction. Hölderlin saw a primordial contact with things, a unity of thought and being underlying all judgment. Subject-object opposition was a consequence of judgment. Hegel, building on the Phenomenology, corrected this, that prior unity is already intersubjective, constituted by mutual recognition, a common world, and community. We don't start as isolated individuals behind a curtain of appearance. We begin as participants within a way of life. Taking this phenomenological conception of agency as his starting point, Hegel concluded that the primary act of judgment, trying to articulate that primordial unity of thought and being which he simply calls being in the logic, itself generates paradoxes. The most famous is the assertion that being and nothing are identical. This isn't just a puzzle. It's meant to show how the primitive, indefinable notion of truth already contains the seeds of skepticism about itself. It introduces a negative relation of our thinking towards itself. The logic's journey, then, is to show that the reassurance we seek, that our judgments and the world aren't irrevocably divorced, can only appear at the very end. It comes in articulating the whole space of reasons, the idea, within which our judgmental activity necessarily operates. What drives this development? The paradoxes themselves. The tensions generated by partial abstract attempts at getting it right push us towards completing the whole. Hegel's technical term for this process of resolution is Aufhebung. It's wonderfully ambiguous in German, carrying the meanings of canceling, raising, and preserving. It perfectly captures the dynamic. Our commitments to certain basic judgments carry commitments to others that seem incompatible canceling. But when viewed from the standpoint of the totality of the space of reasons, these other judgments find their legitimate place raising. Yet, their tensions are never fully abolished, but always remain with us preserving. The paradoxes generated at each stage are the very engine driving the logic towards its completion. Hegel divides his logic into 3 books: Being, Essence, and Concept. The principle behind this division is that different kinds of judgments, with their distinct normative structures involving entitlements, commitments, and the paradoxes they generate, are needed to establish the whole space of reasons. The doctrine of being deals with judgments about finite entities that come to be and pass away. The doctrine of essence concerns judgments about the relationship between appearance and reality. Finally, the doctrine of the concept addresses self-reflexive judgments about the ultimate normative structure of our judgmental activities themselves. In the doctrine of being, an entity or judgment is finite if its conditions for existence or truth lie outside itself. The commitments within this realm commit us to 3 basic types of judgments: qualitative aspects of fleeting things, quantitative aspects, and judgments of measure, like a village growing larger and becoming a city. Each type of judgment implicitly commits us to a conception of the infinite as the whole that legitimizes and orients our activity in that sphere. Hegel criticized traditional Aristotelian logic for mishandling the infinite, either as a metaphysical object or an endless series. He argued calculus offered a better conceptual grasp of the infinite's ideality. However, these finite judgments eventually lead to skepticism about whether being as a whole is really as we describe it. Responding to these doubts requires making judgments not about the transient world itself, but about the relationship between that world and our judgmental activities. This is the domain of the doctrine of essence. It deals with skeptical assertions about gaps between appearance and reality. Hegel argues that such ordinary skeptical judgments, like doubting if something looks as it is, are unintelligible without a prior grasp of a whole in thought containing both appearance and essence. Skepticism is built into self-conscious judgment, but so is the necessity of eventually dissolving the ultimacy of those skeptical doubts. The paradoxes in essence arise from
Yep.
reflectively making, and then doubting the relations between appearances and their supposed essences. Ultimately, these judgments presume a conception of the world as one substance manifesting itself through causal relationships among accidents. This might seem to validate Jacobi's charge that reason leads to Spinoza. But Hegel argues any such monistic view generates new paradoxes about causality itself. Resolving these requires a conception of the whole as a self-sufficient system of interactive reciprocal causation among individual substances, a synthesis of Spinoza's substance, and Kant's emphasis on individuality and interaction. Neither being nor essence can explain the normative structure of judging itself. The norms governing our judgments aren't set by the natural world. The distinction between appearance and reality is a judgmental distinction we import. Reflecting on our place in the causal chain implicitly involves making self-reflexive judgments about the legitimacy of judgment itself. This is the domain of the doctrine of the concept. It concerns the normative structure of our judgmental activities, which cannot be explained naturalistically. Following Kant, Hegel sees the structure of experience, particulars embodying generals, this suches in a whole, as the structure of self-consciousness itself. This non-natural conception doesn't imply dualism or idealist monism. When treating traditional syllogisms, Hegel wasn't just listing categories. He showed the necessity of using certain types of terms and judgments by demonstrating how our comprehension of norms in using terms already presupposes knowing how to use those terms in certain judgments, which in turn presuppose certain syllogistic inferences. Crucially, he argued a theory of inference couldn't be purely formal. Material notions about what counts as logical or pure must be imported from outside. These arise from our implicit understanding of what we're trying to accomplish in inference, our mind's basic interests in sorting things. These interests require us to understand the world as having a rational structure and objectivity divided into ideas of mechanical, chemical, and teleological systems. These ideas characterize patterns of explanatory inference, going beyond ordinary experience, grasping the whole. But how do we justify appealing to these objective systems? Only by appealing to more subjective notions of the true and the good. The idea of getting judgments right is bound up with the idea of what basic interests guide our judgments. What is ultimately good, as shown in the phenomenology, is exercising our free judgmental powers to get it right, disciplining ourselves according to principles we impose on ourselves. What counts as rational survives reason's ongoing internal critique. All judgmental activity takes place within the absolute idea, the general comprehension of the space of reasons. This idea articulates original unity of thought and being active in Geist, and understands the necessity of its rupture and the negativity generated. It offers reassurance, nothing normative lies outside it. It preserves the primitive conception of truth while explaining its inherent skepticism. The absolute idea is the normative, self-correcting structure of modern social space and the pure normative structure of Geist.